How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the most progressive podcast in the world, where your host is always myself, MickyT.
Me, Nostalgia.
And welcome back to another edition of the Genre Essentials. It's actually been a hot minute since we've actually recorded an episode. And we're back on track for the rest of the year. But yeah, we're going to be doing another Genre Essentials, of course. And with that in mind, if you haven't guessed already, we're doing a Genre Essentials on progressive rock.
Ooh.
Prog rock. Everyone's favorite genre, I know. Everyone loves progressive rock. Nobody hates it at all,
Yeah.
I know.
Definitely, yeah. It's definitely one that's still, at its peak.
Definitely, there's
Yeah.
bands out there that are still carrying the torch like fucking Dream Theater and insert other mid-prog band here,
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I gotta take this shit
Yeah.
seriously. Yeah. Anyways, the drill with the prog. I was about to say the prog rock. No, the genre essentials. We have 12 albums here. We're gonna go through each one of them, talk about why they're essential, and just basically give our thoughts on them. The usual drill. So, yeah, ready, boss?
Fuck yeah.
All right. And the first album that we're gonna be talking about today is a fucking hefty one, might I say. It's In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson. This is the 1969 debut album from one of the most legendary and iconic English progressive rock bands of all time, King Crimson, and the album was released under Island Records. Now, funny enough that we're starting off with this album in particular, as not only is In the Court of the Crimson King my favourite prog rock album of all time, it also happens to be my favourite album of all time. Bear with me, since I'll probably be blabbering on for a minute, for a little bit about this album, because I can't help it. But, this album is an undisputed masterpiece of an album for me, and I fucking love and adore this album. In the Court of the Crimson King was one of the earliest and most influential albums in the prog rock genre. It pretty much set in stone a lot of the conventions and typical ideas that the genre would possess, but with that in mind as well, King Crimson were incredibly ahead of their time, and the fact that an album like In the Court of the Crimson King came out in 1969 is mind-blowing to me. I know it's cliche to say, but it's just fucking true. And not to mention, for how this album sounds as well, it's absolutely mind-blowing to me. It is genuinely otherworldly, and I can only imagine what it was like to hear this for the first time in 1969. This 5-track masterpiece contains some of the most beautiful sounding, well-produced, diverse, and fantastic prog rock material ever made, in my opinion. And I feel like there's few projects that can live up to the caliber of what's presented in The Court of the Crimson King. It doesn't take long to get in your face with 21st Century Schizoid Man, but thereafter it just becomes this very mellow, meticulous, and soothing piece. With those tracks especially, they just sound massive and larger than life, but at the same time, the instrumentation remains just very technical, complex, and very playful. I suppose instrumentals are very much the most important part of In the Court of the Crimson King, as they're absolutely incredible across this album. There's lots of diverse ideas and interesting influences that make In the Court of the Crimson King take shape, like the tinges of jazz rock, symphonic instrumentation, psych rock, free improv, but they all culminate in ways that kind of feel detached from all that solely and feels like its own thing. Wait, I said that wrong, but it's okay. And it was really prog rock, and it was fantastic to say the least. When it came to the instrumentation and the musicianship, you obviously get rock instrumentation, but as well as that, they're accompanied by woodwind instruments, vibraphones, horns, mellotrons, which provide the epic atmospheres that this album is known for, and they are all played and performed with just incredible passion and incredible ease, especially when it comes to the drumming from Michael Giles, who was an absolute beast and one of the most overlooked drummers ever. As well as that, there's brilliant, varied guitar work from King Crimson's only consistent member, Robert Fripp, who does a lot of varied and interesting things tonally across this album. Greg Lake's passionate vocals are great, the songwriting is fantastic too, and the band just keep it very interesting with its eclectic influences and long, ever-changing song structures. So yeah, the technicality is impressive, the complexity is impressive, the performances are impressive, songwriting is impressive, the production is impressive, but also the individual songs are impressive and are all masterpieces in my opinion. I totally get if someone doesn't really like the latter half of Moonchild though, but I don't care, I love it. Some of my favourite songs of all time are in this album's track list. Some of the most breathtaking material I've ever heard is on this album. And every time I listen to it, I just get so engrossed in it and get lost within the incredible music that each track beholds. I think if you're gonna get into the prog, this should be one of the first albums you hear. Maybe not the first, but one of the first. And yeah, I'll stop dick riding. Yeah, it's a great album. It's essential.
Yeah, we're most certainly starting off with a bang. This album is the very definition of a classic in basically every department. It's one of the most iconic albums of all time, and of course it's one of the best albums of all time. While this wasn't exactly the first prog rock album, bands like Soft Machine, Yes, and Deep Purple did get in there first. It still came at a time when the genre was in its absolute infancy, and any of the prog albums released before 1970, if any of them stood the test of time, it's this one. This is still far and above one of the most influential albums in the genre to this day. It still, did more for the genre and in progressing its sound. Get it? Progressing. Than so many albums that came decades after it. It's crazy to believe that a mere decade before this album's conception, rock and roll and rockabilly were at their most dominant, and rock kind of stood entirely separate from the whole jazz scene. Despite the progress made to popular music and its boundaries throughout the 60s, thanks to the likes of the Beatles and the Velvet Underground, and just the entire psychedelic rock scene, I truly just don't believe that anyone was quite ready for this. Even in 1969, by the end of the 60s, its compositions, its intensity, its instrumentation, it all sounds too good to be real even today. Never mind half a century ago. The jazz influenced instrumentation and free improvisation is just exhilarating at its most intense. And it's psychedelically complex at moments as well. There's moments of beauty, there's moments of emotion, there's moments of intensity and ferocity. This album is just an absolute, jack of all trades. The guitar work is legendary, the bass work is just faultless. Greg Lake's vocals are as iconic and powerfully triumphant as it gets. And the drumming, especially on the opening track, 21st Century Schizoid Man, is just out of this world. The sheer cohesion the band, manages to achieve with compositions this hypnotizingly complex is an achievement in of itself. But the amount of beauty and emotion this album presents without sacrificing any intensity, any density, any technicality is what really blows me away. Years after hearing it for the first time, hearing the train horns at the start of the album, it fills me with the same excitement that it did years ago. It's an album that is timeless, that is effortlessly just perfect in every way. And yeah, it's definitely one of the progressive rock albums of all time.
Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, best and worst tracks, well, all of them. But if I had to be specific, I'd go with 21st Century Schizoid Man, Epitaph, and Moonchild. I have no least favorites.
My three favorites, if I had to pick, are 21st Century Schizoid Man, Epitaph, and In the Court of the Crimson King.
Epic.
Alright. Next up, we have an album from a little bit more of a niche band, the Graaf Generator, with Pawn Hearts, released in 1971. Pawn Hearts was one of the first few albums, English.
Can man speak?
Alright, Pawn Hearts was the first of a few albums that I'm only listening to the first time in preparation for this episode. And I just do not understand why this album isn't as highly lauded and talked about as a lot of other prog albums, because this thing is absolutely fantastic. Pawn Hearts is powerfully intense, it's anxiously dark, and completely dissonant throughout. It's an absolutely manic and eclectic journey through three incredibly well fleshed out and assembled tracks. Instrumentally, this thing takes heavy influences from, the free flowing nature and certain instrumental incorporations of jazz, with the technicality of prog and avant prog, to create an album that genuinely isn't really comparable to much else in the genre or in any genre. It's such a complex and unpredictable experience, with every moment leaving you on edge. Even the more subtle and slow burning sections never really leave you fully comfortable, because it soon becomes apparent that the album is far too chaotic and just unpredictable to ever stick to one idea for too long. It shuffles through eclectic genre influences and unorthodox instrumental passages like it's nothing, all of which are performed with, the technical prowess that one would expect from prog rock. The vocal and lyrical work of Peter Hamel has to get a specific shout out for just how entrancingly strange yet beautiful it is. The vocals throughout are just as much of an instrument as, the drums, guitar, bass, anything else. This thing is just so ambitious. It's crazy that it predates many of the iconic albums that, defined the genre through the decades. And in my eyes, it's an absolute essential album for any prog listener, and one whose influence may often be understated. But in my eyes, I think it does belong kind of in the same league as a lot of the big boys of the genre. It definitely did a lot to push the prog rock sound forward into new horizons. And yeah, it's definitely a classic.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as you when I say Van de Graaf Generator are a band in the prog sphere that I've been meaning to check out for a while now, and Pawn Hearts is the first album of theirs I ever got to check out for this list. They're one of those bands that fall into the somewhat niche category of influential prog rock bands, and they've made some essential prog rock albums in their discography, Pawn Hearts being one of them, and it's just that, essential. It's also great, in case that wasn't clear as well. Pawn Hearts' setup is not that different from what you'd expect from a prog rock album, but what they managed to do on this album is nothing to scoff at, as it's incredibly impressive to say the least, and it leans into a lot of the kind of weirder sides of prog, because some of the passages are just really out there and interesting. They're also just really dense and really layered and just kind of unlike anything of its time, really. Pawn Hearts itself has 3 tracks, 2 tracks over 10 minutes and one final one over 20 minutes. They're all these dense, multi-phased epics, and within those multi-phase epics, there's consistently engrossing and exciting moments that are just really well written, well performed, produced well, sound fantastic from front to back, and are honestly really unique for 1971. There's a lot to unpack from these tracks based on what Van de Graaf Generator tried to do sonically, as there's passages that takes lots of different twists and turns and moods. What keeps it together and concise, though, is how just insanely technical and atmospheric a lot of it is. It contains passages that feel very surreal and very atmospheric. There's moments that are just very manic and chaotic. There's some passages that kind of go into some avant-prog territories, particularly in the opening track, and it's just fucking fantastic, to say the least. The production as well is fantastic. It takes this album's sound to an otherworldly place, and it genuinely, it's like the cover. You're just kind of floating around there, and it's just like you're seeing all this crazy shit happening. And with that otherworldly sound, just the instrumentation is just amazing as well. And at points, I was floating. I won't even lie. Instrumentally, like I mentioned, this album is, it's very tight, technical, dense, and complex. Each contribution is incredibly meticulous and tight, and every bit of the instrumentation shines. I gotta give mad props to David Jackson, though, who played all the horns on this record. Some of the sounds that came from those horn sections are just fucking nuts, and that's mainly thanks to him. What he did here was just nuts, generally. The percussion was fantastic from this as well, from Guy Evans. I really love Peter Hamel's kind of eclectic yet whacked out vocals across this thing too. I agree with what you said. His voice is basically like an instrument as well in this album, and he just suits it perfectly. The keyboards and the atmospherics from Hugh Banton are also fantastic, and to my surprise, Robert Fripp did something on this album too. What that was, I have no idea, but apparently he did. He was a very busy man.
Shout out.
So, shout out Robert Fripp.
Not sure what for, but shout out.
So yeah, instrumentally, compositionally, this album is just mad. I think what it does is really interesting and worthwhile. And just bringing it back a little TCT vocabulary here. This is prog fuckage, to say the least. And yeah, I've not much else to say there. Moving on to best and worst tracks. All of them. They're all great on this album. I won't even lie. I have no least favorites.
Yep, handy enough that there's 3. All of them.
Way too handy. Excuse me. And okay, we're moving on to our third pick, and another absolute fucking classic with this one. Mm-hmm. We have Close to the Edge by Yes. This is the 5th album from the legendary London-based prog rock band Yes, and it was released in 1972 under Atlantic Records. Yes, are another iconic band in the UK prog scene that have made a lot of classic records back in the day, but by far their most loved and most acclaimed album is the one we're talking about here, Close to the Edge, which maintains its classic status for a very good reason. This album is simply just fantastic and contains one of the most essential prog rock songs ever made, in my opinion. There's just rarely a moment on this album that feels kind of weak or limp. I think Yes managed to take the best elements of prog and do them justice by creating just breathtaking moment after breathtaking moment, all that are just like written, that are, excuse me, let me just say that again, all of which are the songwriting on across this thing is just really unique and interesting. It does what it does masterfully, and at its peaks you will actually be achieving nirvana, I shit you not, which in the case of the title track is just that. And honestly, that title track alone is one of the most perfect prog rock songs ever made, in my opinion. The title track is obviously composed in a multi-phase fashion. It incorporates a lot of its lengthy runtime. It has some technical passages and some atmospheric passages, but it all comes together in a way that makes it such a euphoric track. Plus, the way it's kind of structured compositionally is really interesting as well. Like, the kind of songwriting quirks that goes into a lot of this kind of subtle quirks are really unique as well, and I think that Yes managed to do it in such a really tasteful way. I won't spoil any further, but I'd say you need to hear this song especially. It's definitely it's long enough, but it's worth it because it has peaks that are just euphoric, and it is fantastic. You know, the album is just musically fantastic. The band just does not skip a beat at all with what they try to do here, and I think everybody does a fantastic job with their respective roles. That in and of itself culminates into why a lot of this album is fantastic. There's plenty of moments in the title track that just display their technicality incredibly well, but even then the others have these other passages and moments that are just fantastic, and they just feel very interesting in the way that they're very meticulous and indulge in its atmospherics. I have to give massive props to Rick Wakeman especially, who did keyboards and organs across this album, so he basically just created the music that will play at the gateways to heaven, basically. Because what he did on this is just insane to me. Also, Chris Squire is a fucking fantastic bassist. Really unique tone, really unique playing. Was very standout. Vocals from John Anderson are fantastic as well. I think he's one of the best prog rock vocalists ever. And he gives the band a very interesting sense of melody on this album. And I really loved his vocals across this. Definitely one of my favorite prog vocalists. I think I've already made it clear that I fucking love the title track. I think And You and I is also peak music. Bit more over the top, but it still sounds gorgeous. And the final track, Siberian Cather, is really cool as well. And just to finish off, yeah, Close to the Edge is another classic. It's another classic prog rock album that I think everybody needs to hear. I think it should be one of the first you hear, actually. It's one of my favorites, definitely, and it's absolutely deserving of the acclaim that it gets. It's breathtaking, and Yes, just do prog too well on this. It's actually unfair. Holy shit.
Yeah, as you'll soon come to realize, symphonic prog is probably the most notable subgenre of prog rock, and one that encompasses a lot of the genre's finest moments in prog history. Yet, I don't think there's any better face for that subgenre than Close to the Edge. Symphonic prog is prog at its most experimental, free-thinking, eclectic, throwing any predictable rock structures out of the window and carving its own path using any genre influences it wants to, just to deliver very complex, ever-changing, and oftentimes classical infused compositions. Close to the Edge does exactly that. It is overwhelmingly complex and triumphant, and the result of just creative and technical perfection in my eyes. I have, if there's any album that warrants the use of the word epic, as much as the internet has killed that term, it's this, because there's just no better term to encapsulate this album, and specifically those moments of just pure euphoria that you mentioned. It's just so mind-boggling how this album progresses and what this album is able to achieve in its compositions. The opening 18-minute long title track is perhaps some of the most just iconic and memorable, and some of the best 18 minutes in prog history, transitioning between super catchy, sweet, and memorable verses to just absolutely adrenaline pumping, magically dense, and oftentimes hauntingly atmospheric instrumental sections that just seamlessly transition from one into the next. Again, it's performed with a jaw-dropping precision and accuracy, and composed with an almost inhuman level of attention to detail. The second track follows in the first footsteps with some absolutely spine-tinglingly powerful and anthemic moments, and the final track, Siberian Cathru, is as balls to the wall and as upbeat as a rock masterpiece can get. It's got some classical elements, but it combines everything with a hard rock instrumental and hard rock structure to make this a track that is kind of easy to listen to, yet still absolutely perfect in its execution and its composition. It's yet another album that deserves every fiber of praise that comes its way. It's one of the greatest achievements in rock history from start to finish, and yeah, it's undoubtedly an essential in the world of progressive rock.
Absolutely. And yeah, with that in mind, best worst tracks, all of them. It was too easy for this one. But if I had to go specifically, I would go with the title track. Everyone needs to at least hear that song, especially. That song is just wow.
Yeah, exactly what you said. Alright. Up next, we have Thick as a Brick, the fifth studio album by British rock band Jethro Tull, released on March 3rd, 1972. This is a bit of a funny one. Thick as a Brick is perhaps the most extreme example of someone overcommitting to a joke. An album which started as a gag to poke fun at, music critics who claimed their last album to be a concept album, when Ian Anderson never intended for that to be the case. Soon became a fully fledged prog rock epic and one of the most iconic and important albums in the genre to this very day. Thick as a Brick is made up of one single continuous self-titled title track that is separated into two 20-minute plus halves. And to say that this piece manages to cover a lot of ground in those combined 43 minutes would be one hell of an understatement. The album's composition is just ridiculously complex and so meticulous for something that was intended to be satirical. Yet the playfulness is still very much there regardless. Featuring Jethro Tull's iconic combination of prog rock and folk rock, the album is just a fantastic roller coaster of technical instrumentation, brilliant guitar work, and winding composition. Aside from a few kind of familiar verses and motifs that appear a few times throughout and provide sort of a catchy and memorable foundation for the project, the music just builds, collapses, expands, and progresses in every way imaginable to get from one section to another, and all of it flows so effortlessly well. It's just so continuous, yet so varied and progressive in what it does. And that 40-minute runtime feels like you're just time traveling with how fast it flies and how much ground you're able to cover in a relatively short amount of time. Instrumentally, this thing is crafted with the precision of like a Da Vinci surgery robot. The kick-ass guitar work transitions from acoustic to electric seamlessly. The bass and drum work is silky smooth and energetic and unique, and the inclusions of instruments ranging from flutes and saxophones to lutes and harpsichords are implemented so well that it's easy to forget how atypical some of these instruments are in rock music. It's an absolute masterpiece. It's immensely beautiful, effortlessly complex, and completely in its own, bubble when it comes to prog rock. There's really not much like it. And I'm going to say that about a lot of albums because that's just how it is.
Yeah. Jethro Tull are another very legendary band that came from the UK's 70s rock scene. They were a band that incorporated a lot of kind of blues and folk rock elements into their sound, and they were also a band that were, well known for their humor and their tongue-in-cheek portrayal. And all of those elements culminate into what I consider their best work, Thick as a Brick. And this is probably going to sound weird, but I'm sure you already know the context of the album, so Thick as a Brick also happens to be like one of those meta prog rock albums ever. of course, everyone knows Jethro Tull made Aqualung, another fantastic album in their discography. It was labeled as a concept album by critics who reviewed the album, even though, according to the band, it wasn't one. So then, of course, they decided to, take the piss out of the ever-growing, prog rock scene at the time and basically just mess with everyone while making a prog rock record in progress. And like you said, it's best example of a of a joke that went a bit too overboard. But so it's basically a joke concept album, and as much as I love prog, this piss take is very entertaining and very funny, I will say. But it's also just fantastic, musically as well. It's just a fantastic album. It's basically one massive song with two sides that go for about 20 minutes each. And what Jethro Tull do with the song is simply brilliant. Musically, Jethro Tull just knock out of the park with what they try to do over the course of 40 minutes, and it comes together and flows just really well. Compositionally, it's just really ambitious, but the band are talented enough to pull it off, and they most certainly do that, since instrumentally this album is just very fucking good, to say the least. The writing is intricate, the playing is tight, the melodies are memorable, the satirical lyricism is really funny, and every section of this album feels really well put together and in place. Nothing feels kind of tacked on or overindulgent to me. It's just, it feels free-flowing, feels very well-paced, very well performed, and just generally really fantastic. The rock and folk influences blend very well with each other, and all in all, this album is fantastic. It's a great listen that has the composition, instrumentation, and charm to suffice. I think, generally, I think it's Jethro Tull's best album, and I think it's the best representation of their work. But also just the fact that the context behind it as well also just kind of adds to it too. Because I'm sure, if you just gave this to someone out of nowhere, didn't really give them context, they would try and read the lyrics and like, the fuck are these guys on about? Is there some kind of concept that I'm not getting? Am I too small brained for these big brained prog rock artists? No, they're just taking the piss. But yeah, anyways, it's great. Thick as a Brick is fantastic. It's essential, and yeah, listen to it. And with that in mind, best track, well, yeah, all of them. No least favorite track.
Yeah, ditto. I mean, what else am I going to say?
I mean, what the fuck else are you going to say,
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. We have Octopus by Gentle Giant. This is the fourth album from the Portsmouth prog rock band Gentle Giant. It was released in 1972, and it was released under Mercury Records. Gentle Giant are another kind of cult prog rock band that were actually somewhat short-lived for a prog rock band, as they disbanded only after 10 years as a band in 1980, which is basically only a year in prog rock terms. They were also one of those bands that had multiple classics under their name, including the record we are talking about right now, Octopus. And it's a really great record, a record that took me a little bit of time to fully get into, but it did eventually click with me. I suppose what put me off about Octopus when I first listened to it was the aspect of the music that I think people love about this album the most, that being the more kind of quirky and somewhat goofy nature to some of the song ideas that the band put together in this album. Even then, I was still blown away by the musicianship, but that aspect kind of put me off. And here we are now, though, and it's grown on me a lot since then. Now, I think that playful goofiness is what makes Gentle Giant an interesting band. They still showcase a lot of elements that we normally see in prog rock, but that aspect that they bring, as well as some of the more medieval type influences, make them fairly unique. Not to mention, the somewhat avant-garde tinges also add to that. Now, in the end, though, they do make some fantastic music on Octopus. The instrumentals on this album are complex and technical, but they're also really playful. There's a fun aura to what the band are doing on this album, and you can hear it through the material on here. There's a lot of really interesting grooves and odd time signatures. The production is very good, and the additional bits of instrumentation are incorporated really well. I also really appreciate this band for not really featuring compositional and lengthy tracks that that most prog rock albums typically do. Don't get me wrong, I love a lengthy boy or multiple tracks that make up a lengthy boy, but multiple great prog songs with traditional lengths are also very cool. Thank you very much, Gentle Giant. Especially when you're going through a list like this, it can get taxing, but still. And yeah, I thought Octopus was very good. It's a really unique take on prog, and it's definitely one that's a grower in my opinion. Some tracks may not work all that well, but at the same time, the album itself has plenty of really slick, playful and fantastic tracks to its name. Go.
Oh, I'll edit it out. Octopus has to be one of the most underappreciated albums of all time. Not to say those familiar with the album don't see the magic I see, but this album or this band just never simply had the eyes on them that they deserved, especially in comparison to contemporary artists. In my eyes, they're up there with the likes of Yes, Jethro, Tull, Rush, and a few other notable bands in prog rock history as just legends of the genre, and Octopus is their crowning achievement. This album sees us, again, step away from the whole concept album, long-ass track shenanigans, synonymous with 70s prog. There's 8 tracks on here. Almost all of them are like 4 minutes in length. There's no nonsense. It's playful, yet experimental, and everything is in small bites. It's in easy to digest chunks. There's nothing too overwhelming about this project, and I respect it for that. The music on Octopus is largely what you may expect from a symphonic prog album. The aesthetic here is very medieval and fantasy-esque, not just in its songwriting, as is the case with a lot of symphonic prog, but the entire sound of this album feels like it could be the soundtrack to a very cheesy spin-off Lord of the Rings musical or something, and I'm here for it. However brief the tracks on Octopus may be, don't for a second think that makes them any less complex or technically impressive. It's prog, of course it doesn't, but the 8 tracks here vary a lot throughout, from the madrigal vocal stylings and off-kilter instrumentation of knots to the folky grooves on the opening track. This album, despite only being 34 minutes long, really presents a lot for the listener to digest, and even after several listens, the excitement doesn't fade. It also took me quite a few listens to really appreciate this thing for what it is, and that's saying a lot considering it is quite brief, but it just goes to show how much it presents in those 34 minutes. That both me and Mick kind of had the same experience where we had to give it more than one listen to really let everything sink in. It's playfully experimental, covering a wide variety of styles, themes, emotions. Yet everything presented here remains effortlessly cool nonetheless. The instrumentals are sleek, on point, the production is amazing, and the instruments used throughout are too diverse to list off, which is not surprising considering pretty much every member of the band is a multi-instrumentalist. All of this, again, may I remind you, in 34 minutes. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's definitely one I recommend.
Yeah. Best tracks on Octopus are The Advent of Panurge, A Cry for Everyone, and The Boys in the Band. If I had to pick a least favourite, I'd go with Dog's Life.
My favourites are The Advent of Panurge, A Cry for Everyone, The Boys in the Band. My least favourite track is Nuts.
Oh, we were just so close there.
Next up, we have a small indie band. And their small indie album called The Dark Side of the Moon, which is obviously the 8th studio album by English rock band Pink Floyd, released in March 1973. Yep, it's The Dark Side of the Moon. It's Pink Floyd, the band that is, for a lot of people, understandably, the first thing that comes to mind when you think of prog rock. They've done so much within the genre. They've released so many. We could have realistically included about 4 or 5 Pink Floyd albums in this list. They would not look out of their own depth. We could have made a genre essentials list and only included like Pink Floyd albums. There's a certain amount of people who would have been like, yeah, this sounds right. But we'll narrow it down to one, and we'll narrow it down to the big one, The Dark Side of the Moon. If you're listening to this podcast, then let's be honest, you have even a passing interest in music, and that means that you have heard The Dark Side of the Moon. And you probably don't need us to explain to you why it's amazing. It's quite possibly the most famous album of all time. It's just... what was the record it broke? Wasn't it on the album charts for like...
It was
30 years or something, until the 90s?
Something ridiculous like that.
Yeah, you've heard this album, your parents have heard this album, your grandparents have heard this album. Everyone you know has probably heard this album. So I'll keep things somewhat brief. This thing is an absolute masterpiece. It's the finest example of an album as an art medium. Aside from maybe Money, there isn't a single track on here that sounds as good by itself as it does in the context of this album. Because to me, this thing honestly feels like one individual 42-minute long piece. The individual tracks throughout may not compositionally be anywhere near as complex or instrumentally technical as some of the albums we've talked about prior, but what this album lacks in complexity on a solely instrumental level, it makes up for the sheer complexity in its timelessly incredible production and psychedelic sound palettes, unlike anything that was around back in 1973. This album is a masterpiece in texture, in terms of thematic exploration, and in terms of sheer scope. It lacks a lot of the complexity, playfulness, and eccentricity that is synonymous with prog rock, but what it doesn't lack is just the pure class and atmospheric genius. It's just as complex as the other albums we've talked about, just in a different way. It explores dark, twisted, maniacal, yet beautifully poetic and haunting meditative soundscapes that almost feel like an otherworldly dream, while simultaneously tackling very real issues such as mental decline, death, corruption, and just so much more. The entirety of this album has aged better than perhaps anything else released in the 70s. Its studio magic and artistry is still just as impressive today, and still just sounds as futuristic today as it would have back then. It truly is one of the best albums of all time. Yeah, but it's also Dark Side of the Moon, so you already know all of that.
Yeah. It's it's about time we got to the resident Pink Floyd album of the prog rock essentials. You know, after a bit of discussion, we decided to agree on the most basic bitch pick of the bunch, and that was, of course, the absolutely legendary Dark Side of the Moon. Who would have guessed?
I would say, listen to Animals. Continue.
Also, listen to Wish You Were Here. Continue. For real though,
Okay,
Pink Floyd have. For real though, Pink Floyd has so many essential albums in their catalog, like that. It's insane. We could pretty much make our own fucking list based off of essential Pink Floyd albums. But you know, we already did a Pink Floyd Worst Best like 3 years ago. But whatever. But to me, Dark Side of the Moon is, I'd say it's probably the most essential when it comes to the grander scheme of progressive rock. Sure, it may not be the most technical or complex prog rock album on the surface in terms of instrumentation, but it's complex and technical in what it tries to do in terms of its studio magic. It's what it tries to do structurally, and generally its iconic status and how definitive it is for the genre is really a key factor as to why it's here. And even then, it's just fantastic. You know, The Dark Side of the Moon is just an incredible album, to say the least. It's as beloved as it is for a reason, and it's just a trip of an album from front to back. It's basically one big song that brings in a lot of psychedelia, additional instrumentation, and an overarching concept together with repetitive motifs and slow chord progressions, and a lot of it just ends up being peak music you will absolutely be ascending to. Some of the most otherworldly and iconic rock tracks of all time are on this album, each being so memorable and distinct, but what ties it all together is that aforementioned concept, and also how they're just, you know, peak music that will make you ascend, pretty much. The instrumentation, like I said before, isn't the most technical or flashy that you'll ever hear from a prog band, but that wouldn't really matter all that much when the ideas and the instrumentation culminate into so many fantastic moments, plus the immense space rock and psychedelia all over this album. With the amount of space rock and psychedelia all over this album, there's no need to get flashy. You just gotta kick back, relax, and descend. Still, so many individual moments by themselves are fantastic on this thing. I don't really agree with what you were saying earlier about about a lot of it being, I guess, Money being like the only one you kind of listen to out of the context of the album, because I think there's a few that you can pick out.
It's not the only one I'd listen out of the context of the album. I think it's the only one that's just as good out of the context of the album. I think the flow of the album adds so much to every other track.
I mean, I'd argue there's a couple of more that you could mention, fair. But like, fair enough. Yeah. Either way, so many individual moments by themselves are just incredible on this thing, in my opinion. Plus, the album flows. Plus, as the album flows, it doesn't feel sloppy or anything like that. It feels kind of perfectly balanced in sequence, and each time I go back to the album, that aspect makes me appreciate it so much more. Plus, the production, the studio wizardry, and the performances are just excellent on this album. The production is unbelievably good. It is aged amazingly. The instrumentation is fantastic. It's simple yet effective. Especially the guitar work from David Gilmour. Puts a lot of soul into it, you know? As if hasn't been said about David Gilmour millions of fucking times. And yeah, the songs and the singer just peak. So yeah, Dark Side of the Moon. Bit overlooked, don't you think? Nah. Let's be real. You've all heard this fucking album. I don't need to tell you that you need to listen to it. I'm sure you've already have. And yeah, we'll move on to best and worst tracks then. How about that? And yeah, for me, my favorite tracks on Dark Side of the Moon are Time, The Great Gig in the Sky, and Us and Them. If I had to pick a least favorite, I always get killed for saying this, but Eclipse.
Cool. Well, my favorite tracks are Time, Money, and Brain Damage, and I'm not going to pick a least favorite. I'm not controversial.
Of course you're not. Of course you're not. You won't drag yourself into the shit, huh?
I would just be disingenuous because I love everything.
I do too, but like Eclipse doesn't need to be a song on its own.
It's grand.
Okay, let's move on to the second half of the list. And we're going to kick that second half off with Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield. Tubular Bells is the debut album from English musician and multi-instrumentalist Mike Oldfield. It was released in 1973 under Virgin, and this is also the first entry on our list that features a solo artist rather than a band. So Tubular Bells is another fairly famous prog rock record during its time, and even some people who haven't heard the album will probably have heard one of the key melodies in it, especially if you're a fan of horror, and the opening melody of Tubular Bells was basically used... No, especially if you're a fan of horror, as the opening melody to Tubular Bells was used as the main theme for iconic horror movie The Exorcist. I specifically had a moment of, oh shit, this is familiar when I heard it, but I digress. The Tubular Bells album itself is pretty good on its own. I wouldn't consider it one of my favourites on the list though. You know, that doesn't take away from what Mike Oldfield was doing on Tubular Bells anyway, as what's presented on this album is really impressive, especially considering that Mike Oldfield himself was 19 years old when he recorded this album. And also considering that Mike himself did the majority of the instrumental work and the songwriting across this album. Like, what the fuck were you doing when you were 19? Like, plus, with it being these two long compositions that are well over 20 minutes, it's all the more impressive with what Mike was able to achieve here. The only reason why I don't love it as much as the other albums on this list is because I think the other albums on the list offer a bit more replayability and memorability for me. No slate against Tubular Bells, but, you know, it's just what I think. But what I do like about Tubular Bells can't go understated. I think instrumentally, the work that went into this album is really interesting, and the repetitive and kind of minimalistic kind of songwriting really lent itself well to what Mike was doing on this album. The production and the sound of this album is fantastic as well. And, you know, given what's going on in the album, there's like a richness to the production that adds to it. Plus, the dense instrumentation at its best is just pure magic. So yeah, I still think this is a really good album. I think what Mike Oldfield does in this album is really impressive. And I hope that sometime down the road that maybe it can grow on me a bit more. But for now, it gets a thumbs up from me. It's really good for what it does. It's essential. I think, personally, I just prefer a few other albums on the list.
I'm right there with you. I think Tubular Bells, it is far from my favourite album on this list. But nonetheless, it's one that I find absolutely fascinating. The album itself is one of the quirkiest, most unorthodox and eclectic albums I've heard. It's pretty much entirely instrumental and composed using an encyclopedia of instruments, every single one of which was played by Oldfield himself. And as you said, if that wasn't impressive enough, he was 19. When I was 19, I was covering Weezer songs with my band in my garage. Let me just list off some of...
Why don't you just say garage like a normal person?
Because it's Weezer.
Fuck.
In my garage. Let me just list off some of the instruments that he played on this album. Played to a near virtuoso level and incorporated into this immense composition. Farfisa organ, what the fuck is that? Electric guitar, bass guitar, acoustic guitar, Lowry organ, rider, sound engineer, grand piano, glockenspiel guitar, organ, mando guitar, fuzzbox, percussion, flageolet, honky-tonky piano, tubular bells, piano, concert, timpani, sound effects, Hammond organ, Spanish guitar, choir, conductor,
I think we get it.
Where do you find half of these things? What 19-year-old knows has access to a honky-tonky piano? Again,
I think we get it.
the final product is just one massive composition. It's whining, it's expansive, it's wholly unusual. Yet despite this, it's one of the most iconic and best-selling albums of the 70s. A lot of people in the 70s just had this in their collection. It was a staple at the time. And while it didn't pick up any attention at first, but, then Exorcist happened. The opening motif was, as you said, used as the theme song for The Exorcist, and this thing just blew up from there. It's interesting, and as dense as this album is, though, it's not one that clicked with me as much as the other albums we're talking about today. Don't get me wrong, I think it's great. I think it's fascinating, and it's one that I thoroughly enjoyed listening to every time I did. But it just isn't a personal favorite when it comes to this list. However, I feel like a list like this would make absolutely no sense if we didn't include an album as iconic and as famous as this. It is one of the staples of symphonic prog, and yeah, as I said, it's about as iconic as it gets.
All right. Best track? Yeah, it's one of those ones again. Worst track? None.
I will say Tubular Bells Part 1 is better.
I agree.
Yeah, but best tracks, worst tracks doesn't really work with a lot of these.
I'll just say it anyway.
You're not really meant to
no,
dissect the album like that. But anyways, moving on. We have
this one now.
An album from Jeremy Clarkson's favorite band, Genesis. It is the 5th studio album by progressive rock band Genesis, selling England by the pound, released in October 1973.
Are they really Jeremy Clarkson's favorite band?
No, he fucking hates them famously.
Oh. I had no idea. Okay, then.
It was like, I remember when I used to watch Top Gear, it was a gag where he would there would be Genesis playing on the radio and he'd fucking want to kill himself. It was repeated.
Oh no! Anyway.
Yeah, and completely unnecessary. It was like, come on.
Jesus Christ. Come on,
anyways.
Even Patrick Bateman likes Genesis. Jesus Christ.
I don't know why it's so cool to hate Genesis, but come on, they kick so much fucking ass. At least they did back in the 70s. There's plenty of valid reason to dislike Phil Collins. I almost said Colin Collins.
Why do you call it Collins?
I almost said Colin Collins.
Colin Collins.
There's plenty of valid reason to dislike Phil Collins, and the man's output in the 80s was, aside from the one song, pretty intolerable. But aside from him and things he would do completely apart from early Genesis projects, I see absolutely no reason in this band, getting any shtick or being the weird kind of anomaly laughingstock that it is at times on the internet. At their best, the band is absolutely nothing to scoff at. They were absolute monsters in the prog rock scene, and Selling England by the Pound is my personal favorite Genesis album. They were simply spectacular on this project. It effortlessly manages to make complex prog music sound so easy to digest. It's no wonder that this album was as successful as it was, because everything is just so melodic, it's so anthemic, and below all that, it is so damn complex and intricate and exciting and unique and fresh and new. Peter Gabriel's star power is completely undeniable right from the get-go. His vocal performance on the opening track in particular, but also on the rest of the album, is some of the most impassioned and powerful in prog history, while remaining super vibrant and appealing. Michael Rutherford showcases seriously some of the most infectious bass playing I've heard on any prog album ever. It's so bouncy, so colourful, it's instantly recognisable as him. And then there's Phil Collins, who, I'm sorry, he was a fucking ridiculously great drummer in the 70s. His drumming on this album is just constantly creative. The fills in particular, which he's so famous for, are just so damn good. The man really knew how to implement the fills in just the perfect places. But seriously, listen to this album and listen to the drums. It's nothing as technical as Bonham or anything, but it's so ever changing, so creative. It's constantly trying something new, and I can't help but just applaud Phil for what he manages to do on the drums here. And I feel like I've been brown-nosing guitar work all day, which I guess is to be expected with the genre at hand, but let's just make it quick and say that Stephen Hackett kicks fucking ass, and his super theatric guitar work perfectly matches the theatric style of Genesis. This genuinely is one of the most vividly picturesque, playful, again, theatrical albums on the list. It's so much so that it feels like when I'm listening to it, it's a weird feeling I can't describe, but every time I listen to this album, it feels like I'm watching the album play out in front of me. It's a brilliant album that I return to quite regularly. It's one of my favorite prog albums of all time, and Dancing for the Moonlight Night might be like a top 5, top 10 prog song for me.
How the fuck can anyone hate Genesis in the 70s? God damn. Anyways.
It's just cool to... I don't know. I can't think of any other reason.
Okay, fucking dumbasses. How can you not like this? Anyway. Yeah. Genesis are another one of the prog rock powerhouses of the 70s. Obviously, throughout their history as a band, a lot has changed, and they kind of ditched their prog roots more or less when Peter Gabriel left the band, but many people, including myself, love their 70s prog works, which is absolutely fantastic, and it contains some amazing albums like Foxtrot, which is actually my personal favorite Genesis album, The Lamb Lies Down at Broadway, and the album that we've included for this Essentials, Selling England by the Pound. While I personally prefer those two aforementioned albums, I think Selling England by the Pound is the best starting point that anyone could make with Genesis, as Genesis could be a bit of a turn-off depending on if you like Peter Gabriel's vocals or not, which I personally love. This album features the best lineup that Genesis ever had as well. Plus, this album feels like one of the band's more complete yet digestible albums, while also being just really technical and progressive instrumentally. Also, I think it's probably the band's best in terms of lyrics too, with it being satirical yet serious, like kind of topically, I guess. Selling England by the Pound structurally, balances between lengthy tracks and shorter tracks. They kind of interweave into the track list in that sense, but they all play a part in the album's progressive tendencies, and all of it is really damn great to say the least. Instrumentally, there's barely a flaw to be found on here. It's tightly performed and played well with plenty of just great standout moments, and everyone just keeps up with each other so well. Steve Hackett's guitar playing is fucking phenomenal on this album, and Hackett himself was actually a kind of head of a curve guitarist, especially when it came to kind of tapping and sweep picking. Phil Collins doesn't get enough of his flowers for being a fucking excellent drummer in the 70s. Like, there's plenty of valid reasons to dislike Phil Collins' music, like in the 80s and such, and what he did with Genesis in the 80s, I guess. But he deserves his flowers for the drumming that he did, which is fucking excellent on a lot of the best stuff he was on with Genesis. Tony Banks' keyboard work especially is fantastic as well. Vocally, Peter Gabriel is fantastic too. He's definitely got a vocal style that could be an acquired taste, but honestly, I love what he does vocally on this album, and it's really unique, but it's also just super passionate and often mesmerizing when it's at its best. Also, More Fool Me is a fantastic Phil Collins led vocal track, by the way. Genuinely amazing. Not to mention, one of my favorite prog rock tracks ever is on this album, which is the opener, Dancing with the Moonlit Night, which is easily one of the best songs in the album, which is easily the best song in the album, actually. And far and away, one of the most mesmerizing prog rock tracks ever, in my opinion. There are other fantastic tracks here as well, some great prog rock that has some kind of medieval tinged ideas and influences too. And all in all, it's a great album that should be checked out. So, yeah, it's essential. And we're going to move on to best and worst tracks. If I had to pick, I'd go with Dancing with the Moonlit Night, More Fool Me, and The Cinema Show. If I had to pick a least favorite, I'd go with The Isle of Plenty.
My favorite tracks are Dancing with the Moonlit Night, The Battle for Epping Forest, and The Cinema Show. I do not have a least favorite track. I'm sorry.
Oh, stop being such a wuss.
Stop being so based, you mean?
You're being a wuss. You're not being based.
No. Being based, bro.
No, you're not.
It's on record, bro.
It's not on record. What's on record of you is being an unbased little bitch, innit?
No comment.
Okay, I'm done. What?
No comment.
Okay then. Yeah, we're gonna move on, and we have next album on our list, which is Mirage by Camel. Mirage is the second studio album by the English progressive rock band Camel. It was released in 1974 under Duram. Admittedly, Camel are a band that I also wasn't too familiar with when I was getting into the nitty gritty of this list, so I wasn't really sure as to what I was going to get with them. Excited nonetheless though, and after hearing it, yeah, I get the hype. This is simply fantastic. Camel were a band that was heavily linked alongside bands in the Canterbury scene, which was a scene of prog bands and musicians that were heavy into jazz fusion and free improv, but Camel were so influenced by what's going on in that scene, and they indulged in a lot of what influences that there was there, like lots of jazz fusion and improv, which is found all over Mirage. There's also kind of an aura of immense psychedelia here too, and plenty of fantastic technical jams. But it also manages to fall in line with traditional prog and songwriting that we see in prog, and it culminates into a lot of fantastic passages that is just a great listen. Admittedly, when I was first going through this album, I wasn't too in love with it, but I thought it was still really impressive. But I indulged in more listens, and I grew to love it more, and I grew to love what Camel were doing on Mirage. It was simply breathtaking at its best, and the instrumentals on this album were just insanely refreshing and enjoyable. The instrumental jams across this album, they're very meticulous, they're varied, they're very complex and detailed as well. I love the textures and the production and the immense psychedelia that it's presented in, and the instrumentation is just fantastic. The improv is impressive, the individual magic from the musicians is amazing, and there are some fantastic compositions that these jams draw out to become. The tracks in this album are at their best. When they're at their best, they are amazing. The variety of what's shown on here makes it engaging, and in particular the medleys are just incredible. The atmosphere that these tracks present is wild, and they blend so well with the instrumentation. The drumming, the bass work, the guitar work, the keyboard work, it all just culminates into an incredible package, and there's so many good instrumental moments on here. The bass work especially is fantastic. I don't have too much else to say about Mirage. It's a really unique album in the list, and for me it got better with every listen. I love what the band were able to present on here. I thought it was thoroughly enjoyable. It's complex, it's somewhat technical, it's very psychedelic as well. There's just great jams across this thing. And yeah, it's essential.
Yeah, of all the prog albums that I listened to for the first time in preparation for this episode, Pawn Hearts and two more that we'll get to soon, nothing even comes close to Camel's Mirage for me in terms of quality. This is simply one of the best prog album. I almost said pop.
Were you about to say pop?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ, man. You're too much of a pop head. Jesus Christ.
This is simply one of the best prog albums I've ever heard in my life. And I've just been absolutely infatuated by it ever since the first time I heard it. This album from start to finish is just pure instrumental perfection. The way the instrumentals are constantly unwinding, exploding, and consistently providing moments of life-affirming beauty is incredible. Andrew Latimer's flute work and guitar work combine to create something simply out of this world and psychedelic. This album manages to create textures that sound futuristic but are very much grounded in the album's ever-present fantasy themes and aesthetic, ultimately creating soundscapes and atmospheres that I can't describe as anything other than just simply magic. Speaking of atmospheres, I have to give so much credit to Pete Barden's synth work as well, as it is constantly adding so much layer and texture to this project's atmospheres. It feels like a ribbon that just brings the whole project all together. So yeah, from futuristic mini moog solos to transcendental guitar solos to blistering bass drumming to gentle jazzy moments, this is for sure one of the most brave albums on this list, constantly trying to one-up itself with new ideas, challenging compositions, and an ever-present sense of just awe and wonder. Camel are for sure going to be a band I delve into deeper, and I absolutely beg anyone listening to this to do the same, because especially this album, this is all I've heard so far, but Jesus Christ, it belongs in the upper echelon of prog. It is simply breathtaking. I fucking love it.
I do too. And yeah, my favorite tracks on Mirage are Freefall, Super Twister, and Lady Fantasy. My least favorite track is Earthrise.
My favorite tracks are Nimmerdale, Earthrise, and Lady Fantasy. No least favorites. Deal with it.
Wow. You're really just doing this to spite me. I know this now.
I'm liking music to spite you.
Okay. Wow. I have to be the fucking pretentious critic. Okay, I get it.
Yeah. All right. Up next, we have an album and a band that is near and dear to my heart.
And mine.
And Mick's heart. Some say the best thing to ever come out of Canada.
Woo!
It's Rush with their 8th studio album, Moving Pictures, released in the 80s. We immediately jumped from, I think, what was it, 9 albums in a row that were all early 70s to the 80s. We completely skipped the late 70s.
In the Court of Crimson King came out in 69.
Yeah, there's that, but then
after that it was just
70s.
Yeah, literally.
But yeah, 80s. There was prog still was alive and kicking in the early 80s, mind you. We have some albums from this century as well, so it's not quite dead. Don't let what we said at the start fool ya. It's not quite dead. Just
can I just emphasize first early 80s? Can I just emphasize that first?
Early 80s, yes. All right, so yeah, we're fast forwarding 7 years and moving on to Rush's Moving Pictures. Rush has always been my personal favorite prog band, and the band which served as my first introduction into the genre. And Moving Pictures, believe it or not, is one of my favorite prog albums of all time. While not exactly my favorite Rush album, I do prefer because it's hemispheres. So I combined prefer and hemisphere to say
Jesus Christ.
Prefer. My brain is a jelly.
Men who don't sleep.
I did sleep a bit. While I do prefer Hemispheres and 2112, Moving Pictures is the band's most iconic album and their most famous album, and for good reason. It's, for one, quite easy to digest. It's got a heavy guitar driven hard rock style that makes a lot of these tracks just classic rock staples as well as prog rock staples, and the majority of this album consists of 4-minute long tracks, meaning there's nothing really that challenging about sitting down and listening to this project. Yet despite that, it showcases everything I love about Rush in a neat little 39-minute long package. The band are absolute technical giants. Neil Peart is my favorite drummer of all time. This is coming from a drummer. Geddy Lee is my personal favorite bassist of all time. Alex Lifeson is a top 10 guitarist of all time for me. And all of this talent is absolutely ever present in all of Rush's music, and Moving Pictures is no exception. From the iconic opening track Tom Sawyer with its memorable synth work and dizzying drum fills, to the nostalgic and sentimental Red Barchetta, to the epic The Camera Eye, and then there's also the absolute technical instrumental masterpiece YYZ. This album just presents hit after hit after hit. Geddy Lee's vocals are anthemic and powerful. Lifeson's guitar work is as emotional as a guitar can get, and Peart's drumming sounds it's in a league of its own. The man was born to play the drums. Rest in peace. Absolute legend. This project just kicks ass. It's probably the best introduction to Rush that I could think of, and it fully deserves to be up there in the upper echelon of prog rock. And I really do like what it does with the synth work, kind of bringing in that 80s sound to the album, and I like that it is quite accessible, and it does serve as a pretty nice introduction to the genre for a lot of people. So yeah, rock on.
Rock on in the free world. And do. Fuck's sake, you did it so late. Man,
we're gonna get sued.
Killed it. Nardwar's chill, he won't sue us. Anyways, we finally managed to get away from the 70s and onto the 80s. The era where prog definitely didn't take a massive downgrade, especially some of the greatest bands in the genre. And we finally moved away from a lot of British bands and took a little trip to Canada with a cassette tape favourite, to say the least, Rush. I'm sure we've talked a ton about Rush already before. We did a whole worst to best on them in the past, so if you want to, please check that out. But for now, we want to talk about one of their albums here, which is Moving Pictures. Not one of my favorite Rush records. Like, not my personal favorite, but it's one of my favorite, actually. I should admit, I should say. Well, I fucked that already, Jesus. Anyways, personally, I think Rush have plenty of great to fantastic records in their discography, from 2112 to Permanent Waves, but we've decided to go with probably the band's most well-known album in their discography, Moving Pictures, as I think it's probably the best representation of what Rush were as a band. There's some familiarity in there as well, as I'm sure a lot of people would already know Tom Sawyer, the band's most popular song. And outside of that, all the songs on Moving Pictures are just fantastic, and they culminate into a great album. You know, Rush's style, it's very accessible. It basically brings a commercial lens to the prog rock sound, but I think what Rush manages to do is build a style that feels definitive to them, but also just it's just fantastic generally. I think Rush manages to build on their style with one of their best sounding albums with Moving Pictures, especially with the synth work, as the atmosphere that they display on a lot of this is massive, and they have the instrumental prowess and the songwriting chops to back it up. There's a lot of versatility with what the band do across this album, as there's lots of really catchy, straightforward kind of prog hard rock tracks on it that kind of have a classic rock flavor to them. There's the one very lengthy progressive track here, and there's, you know, very hard hitting and technical moments like just the immensely impressive YYZ, which just blows my mind that humans even made that song. Like, man. And yeah, the members of Rush are, to say the least, incredible musicians, and what they do on this album is just, well, incredible. All three members of Rush are like I agree with me how all three members of Rush are some of my favorite musicians of all time, each in their respective instruments, and their chops are just undeniably fantastic here. Alex Lifeson's guitar work is amazing across this album. He's a top 10 guitarist as well, in my opinion. Geddy Lee is my favorite bassist of all time as well, and yeah, he's just absolutely kills it across this album. I try to learn some of the more quote unquote simple Geddy Lee bass works, but I just genuinely can't. It's insane. And I love me some standout bass work, of course, and Geddy Lee does that to perfection. And of course, who could forget the late legendary Neil Peart? Need I say more? It's Neil fucking Peart. The dude was a cyborg and also a fantastic songwriter. Rest in peace. Yeah, for me, the first side of Moving Pictures is just fantastic. There's not a single moment on the first half that feels dull or incohesive. It's all just such an incredible stretch, and while I personally think the second half may not be as perfect, it's still fantastic, and it has fantastic, like the longest track in the album, The Camera Eye. And also, since going back to this, there's just so many songs I've been replaying like over and over again, like Red Barchetta and Limelight. Red Barchetta especially has just been on rotation for me a fucking lot lately. Reason why, it's genuinely just amazing. Nothing but bangers across this album. It's fantastic. It's an essential album on the list. It's an essential album from a TCT favorite, and yeah, Rush are just fucking sick. You should give this a try if you haven't.
Fuck yeah.
And yeah. Best and worst tracks. My favorite tracks on Moving Pictures are Red Barchetta, YYZ, and Limelight. I have no least favorite track.
My favorite tracks are Red Barchetta, Limelight, and The Camera Eye. No least favorite.
There we go. Finally, we can agree. Okay, and we're going to move on to the final two albums on the Essentials, and we're jumping to the 2000s now. I love how we just majority of this stuck in the 70s. We go to the 80s once, then we move all the way to the fucking 2000s. What happened in the 90s? And yeah,
prog became cool again in the 2000s. Trust.
Fuck yeah. And yeah, we're gonna kick off the last leg of the list with In Absentia by Porcupine Tree. This is the 7th studio album from British prog rock and art rock band Porcupine Tree, which is spearheaded by Stephen Wilson. It was released in 2002 and it came out under Lava. Now, we skipped all the way to the 2000s and we kicked that off with one of the more acclaimed modern prog bands in Porcupine Tree, which is a band that I checked out not too long ago for a discography binge. And In Absentia is definitely one of Porcupine Tree's more standout albums that has, I think, some of the best material that the band ever made on it. I think it's really good, but like I don't think it's one of the best on this list. Now, personally, not like a huge fan of Porcupine Tree or anything. There's a few records in their discography that I do really enjoy, but nothing that I really adore, really. Some of their stuff I just kind of find to be a bit derivative and maybe a bit pretentious, but there are things about the band that I massively respect, and I think those aspects are emphasized on In Absentia, which is definitely one of their best albums. For one, the variety of what Porcupine Tree do in their music is really cool, as they blend a lot of prog and art rock elements together really smoothly. There's also a kind of 90s alternative rock influence that bleeds in as well. And it's interesting when they start to incorporate kind of more metallic guitar tones, which make for some of my personal favorite tracks in this album especially. Plus, production-wise, this album sounds really great. It's clean, but also really fantastic sounding, and when there's blends of atmospheres, it's really damn great. The atmospheric moments are also very well done. I suppose main gripes with the album, prog rock albums are known for being very lengthy and stuff like that, but I genuinely think In Absentia is a bit long-winded for my liking. There's tracks in this album that are a bit derivative and don't do a whole lot for me personally, but that's about it really. I still think there's a lot of really great tracks in this album, and I do really appreciate it for its variety and ideas. And given that Porcupine Tree are one of the more acclaimed bands in modern prog sphere, I think they're worth testing just to see what you'd think. And generally, In Absentia, good album. Not perfect, not one of my favorites on the list, but there's still a lot of things that I do appreciate about what Porcupine Tree do on this album. And
as you said, we're fast forwarding a whole 20 years because the 90s and late 80s were far from the golden era of prog.
Far from it, yes.
It's where iconic prog bands' careers just dwindled. I'll admit it, I was a little worried going into this album. My only prior experience with Steven Wilson was his recent solo albums, which were absolute snooze fests. And Porcupine Tree's most recent album, which was decent at best, but still didn't really do that much for me. But my worries were completely unnecessary because In Absentia is a super powerful album and one which really presents a refreshing style of prog, upgraded for the 2000s. This album has quite heavy alternative rock influences in its more grimy and angsty sound, and also some even heavier prog metal influences, particularly in its heavy guitar work. Now, this was certainly a bit of a worry for me because I don't really enjoy a lot of prog metal at all. I have been a known prog rock hater. I have found a lot of it.
Prog rock hater.
Prog metal hater. I found a lot of it to be quite wanky, and a lot of it takes itself so seriously that it sucks all the fucking soul out of the music. Dream Theater. But this couldn't possibly apply to this album any less. This album's got soul, baby. It's a melancholic yet oddly beautiful album which deals with concepts of lost youthful purity, people on the fringes of society, and even the psychology of serial killers. It's safe to say this album is quite dark. It's quite heavy in its themes, and it's oftentimes very dystopian in its sound. And this whole narrative and this whole sound is perfectly portrayed by Wilson's heartfelt vocals, and a lot of the more lush and gorgeous moments, like the closing track, really kind of represent the innocence that once was, I guess, and it does kind of add a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel for this album. It's a brilliant album. It really stands out among a lot of the albums, mostly from the 70s that we've been talking about so far, in its delivery, in its sound, in its overall atmosphere. It's all new, it's all fresh, but the overall essence of prog very much remains on here. It's just a fresh and updated form, which, let's be honest, the genre really needed to just do something new. And bands like Porcupine Tree and another one we'll be talking about soon are kind of the trailblazers of trying something new within the prog scene. And yeah, this is a great album.
Alright, and with that in mind, my favourite tracks from In Absentia are Blackest Eyes, Lips of Ashes, and Wedding Nails. If I had to pick a least favourite, I'd say Strip the Soul.
Oh fuck, I made an oopsie. I picked 4 favourite tracks. Alright, I'll do Blackest Eyes, Sound of Music, and Gravity Eyelids. My least favourite track is Lips of Ashes.
Aww.
Alright, and finally, we're moving on to the last album, released only 2 years later in 2003. It is... is it De-Loused in the Comatorium?
I think it's...
I've
I
never
say
actually
De-Loused.
said it out loud.
I say De-Loused.
Alright, De-Loused in the Comatorium. I'm realizing that I'm saying it out loud for the first time. Often just referred to as De-Loused. It's the debut studio album by American prog rock band, the Mars Volta. And yep, we conclude the genre essentials with another album that manages to freshen up the prog rock sound for the modern era. The Mars Volta's De-Loused in the Comatorium is a fully fledged assault on the senses with its aggressive yet technically outstanding sound, with frontman Cedric Bixler Zavala's and guitarist Omar Rodriguez Lopez.
You were about to say Omar.
Oh my god, two triple barrel names. Yeah, they were originally part of the iconic post-hardcore outfit at the Drive-In, and they certainly carried a lot of those post-hardcore roots into this project, giving it that aforementioned aggressive and unforgivably in-your-face sound. And it's a combination which really is unlike anything I've heard, prog rock and post-hardcore, yet it's done wonderfully here. The energy of this album is unmatched by any of the other albums in this list in terms of ferocity, in terms of intensity, in terms of raw emotion and exhilarating technical ability. This album is constantly turned up to 100. And on top of this, it effortlessly experiments with really unique influences, ideas, and soundscapes throughout. The compositions here can honestly be best described as simply manic. The guitar work is so frantic and anxious while maintaining that proggy class and intricacy. The vocals are incredible, full of sheer angsty emotion, and the bass work done by none other than Flea, a Red Hot Chili Peppers fame, is absolutely brilliant as well.
Wait, what?
You did not know that?
I did not know that.
That's fun.
What?
That's fun. You find out now. Yeah, Flea
What?
played bass on this album.
Flea?
Yeah, Flea and prog aren't two worlds I thought would ever combine, but I'm sure as fuck glad it came to be, because he definitely adds a lot to the album.
I fucking love Flea. Oh my god.
Yeah, it's a great album to close off the list. It combines two genres I absolutely love, and so it was always going to be an easy sell for me. But I really think this isn't a project you should miss if you want to hear a band do something completely new with the prog rock concept album formula, because this is quite brilliant. Shout out Rick Rubin, did a good job here.
Shout out Rick Rubin. That's actually probably how the connection was there, because Rick Rubin produced a lot for Chili Peppers back in the day. And the Mars Volta are another one of the biggest and most acclaimed modern prog bands, and I genuinely think that they've made some fantastic albums. Their first two, especially De-Loused and Francis the Muse, are by far some of the best modern prog that's out there. The latter especially, which is fucking phenomenal. It's probably, I definitely think it's the Mars Volta's best album. But we've went with the band's debut, De-Loused, which is also a fantastic album. Now, I see De-Loused as a bit of a taste test kind of album, as I'm sure not everyone will be into the Mars Volta sound. It could be an acquired taste, especially if you've only really gotten into, say, traditional prog. But it's worth giving this a go, since this album has a lot of really great moments and ideas to its name, plus it's super fucking unique. I'm sure if you're a fan of the Mars Volta, you'll know about Cedric and Omar's roots in the post-hardcore scene with their previous band at the time, At the Drive-In. A lot of elements from At the Drive-In did kind of carry over into what they would end up doing in the Mars Volta, particularly the more post-hardcore leanings, the anxious vocals, some of the guitar work and tones, and just the ferociousness of what's happening. But with the Mars Volta, they obviously blend it with more progressive compositional leanings and more complex and technical instrumental work, and for the majority of the album, it's executed incredibly well. Obviously, those unique aspects make the Mars Volta what they are is shown in spades across this album, and they're done so well. I think Cedric's vocals are fantastic. They're very passionate, I love the kind of post-hardcore twist that just brought into this album, especially in the vocals, and I think Cedric does it fantastically. The guitar work is stellar, the drumming is fantastic, the bass work is fantastic. How am I only finding out today now that fucking Flea did it? Generally, the production is fantastic as well. I love the textures and the variety across this album. The ambition of the compositions and the ideas are fantastic as well. They culminate into a lot of really great stuff. It's very explosive. It's very dense. Like I said, I personally prefer Francis the Mute and would absolutely recommend it. But De-Loused should be the first Mars Volta album that you hear, in my opinion. There's a lot of magic with what the band do, and yeah, it's essential. It's just a fantastic album, and I think it's another great way to end off this list. And yeah, we'll move on to best and worst tracks. My favorite tracks are Inertiatic Esp, Cicatriz Esp, I hope I'm saying these right, and The Televators. Least favorite track, Tia Mi a las Aranas. I'm so sorry for butchering that, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I'm gonna butcher things too. My favorite tracks are Drunk Ship of Lanterns, Ariatarca, and Cicatriz Esp. I do not have any of these favorite tracks.
And yeah, that's about it. That concludes the prog rock essentials. We fucking did it. Woo, let's go, baby, let's go. And yeah, I haven't got much else to add. Do you want to say something for the outro?
No, I don't. Fucking let's go.
Let's go. Okay then. All right, with that in mind, thank you guys so much for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. We really hope that you enjoyed. Be sure to check out some of the albums that are on this list, and if you've heard them, please let us know down below. Of course, necessary links will be in the description to the Cassette Tapes Discord server, the Cassette Tape Patreon, our own individual channels, and some of our RYM pages as well. And if you wanna join the Discord server and talk to us and a few other like-minded individuals, that's also there too. I know I already said it, but whatever. And also, we live stream sometimes, so if you want to subscribe and check our streams as well, then yeah, they're fun. Okay. And with that in mind, that's about it. My name's MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
Gluck.
Peace.
Bye.
Boy.